Good morning, good evening, everybody. My name is Folashade Soule, and I'd like to welcome you to the second webinar of the Africa-China Working Group of the CORA network that I'm leading. It's titled Shaping the Future of Africa-China Relations, and it's a policy research initiative that is led by the CORA network, a Dakar-based research and policy network, bringing together over 100 researchers, scientists, writers, but also artists from across Africa and the diaspora. And this specific initiative aims to investigate how Africa-China relations impact the political economy of African states, and also how African actors, both governmental and non-governmental, organize and benefit or not from this relationship. So as an Africa-centered initiative, its goal is to engage both scholars and policymakers to rethink in how the Africa-China relationship can be rebalanced in order to address its inherent structural asymmetries and benefits Africa more. So today's webinar will focus on governance frameworks in Africa-China relations and how best to enhance them and make them more inclusive by associating actors also beyond the state level. And the panelists, first Tin Hinan El Kadi from the London School of Economics and Dr. Soule Ibrahim from Conflict Research Network, the Ghana office, will be presenting their recent empirical research on this topic in the digital technology sector, but also the security sector. And their research will be published as part of a special report that will be released early next year. And the panel will be moderated by Dr. Lena Ben Abdallah from Wake Forest University, whose research focuses, among others, on China's engagement in the security sector in Africa, and also questioning the security development nexus in this relationship. Lena is also a member of the CORA network. So thank you all for accepting this invitation. Welcome again to all of you, and also to all the participants. And Tin Hinan, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Folashade, and thanks for organizing this event. I'm just gonna share my screen. Yeah. Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to be presenting today a paper that I wrote as part of this CORA initiative. And the paper particularly looks at China's digital Silk Road in North Africa and zooms on data governance framework. So the title is The Digital Silk Road and Emerging African Data Governance Framework, Evidence from Egypt. So this paper and this presentation is part of my broader PhD project that looks at China's digital investments in Africa and in North Africa in particular. Been doing field work in both Egypt, Algeria, also looking at China's presence also in Morocco and elsewhere in North Africa. So this is the table of content. I'm going to briefly introduce the topic, talk about what is the digital Silk Road for those of you here who are not familiar with the term. Then I'm going to be talking briefly about the Beijing effect when it comes to digital data governance. We'll briefly discuss my methodology, my findings, and conclude with some policy recommendations. Okay. So in recent years, China's ICT multinational corporations have been responsible for building the backbone of the internet infrastructure used by millions of African internet users. So we're not really sure about the specific number, but some people have put forward numbers like 70% of Africa's 4G network would have arguably been built by Huawei. So it's quite a significant rate. And this is due to multiple reasons, one of which is the fact that Huawei and ZTE, which is the other Chinese ICT firm that's quite important on the African continent, are much cheaper than their Western competitors. They tend to come with prices that are like 15 to 20% cheaper than the major Western-based competitors. At the moment, and as it stands, when you look at like the media and like big Western-based think tanks, the debate is very much US-centric. It's about how China's rise as a digital power is threatening the US hegemony over the cyberspace. And the cyberspace has really been dominated by the US and US-based internet firms since, you know, its existence, really. So the debate has recently been very US-centric, and we don't know, actually, there isn't much research on what does China's rise as a digital power mean for developing countries? What does it mean for Africa? What does it mean in terms of digital development? What does it mean in terms of digital transitions? So the question that I'm asking in this paper, like one of the questions, is actually how Chinese firms are managing the data that emerges from Chinese-built digital infrastructure on the continent. And this is especially important considering the growing economic value of data, right? So the central question is phrased here. It's how are data-related projects along the digital Silk Road shaping emerging data governance frameworks and development outcomes in host African countries. And the case study here, as I mentioned earlier, is Egypt. So the digital Silk Road was actually, so one might ask the question of like, why analyzing this in Egypt? Actually, one of the first times the digital Silk Road was mentioned in an official Chinese document was in the 13th five-year plan. It was published by the Central Committee of the Chinese Communist Party, and it highlighted the intention to develop an online Silk Road with the Arab countries and others. And since then, we've seen an influx of Chinese digital capital coming in the region. So it's not only in North Africa, but also in like Gulf countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia that have been like receiving a lot of Chinese digital capital. But as you see here on the map, I have what you're seeing is the so-called, the strategically named peace cables. The Pakistan East Africa Cable Express is being built by Huawei, and it's one of the longest fiber optic cables that exist. It connects, you don't see it in this map, but it connects China to Pakistan and then Pakistan to Europe, going through all of East Africa and Egypt in particular. So Huawei and Egypt have gained more markets in Egypt across over the past years. They're responsible about building, the bulk of the 4G network. It's likely that Huawei will be leading the shift towards 5G, just because it makes more economic cost. Once you have a provider that has already provided the infrastructure, it's cheaper to continue with the same supplier. Like lots of data centers, smart cities, artificial intelligence programs are being developed between Egypt and China. And so far, we don't know what are the implications of these partnerships and who's winning, who's losing, and what are the consequences for Egypt's digital economy. So there is an interesting concept emerging in the literature called the Beijing effect when it comes to data governance framework. And the theory is that China is influencing other developing countries that are part of the so-called digital Silk Road through three main mechanisms, mainly that China is first unintentionally diffusing its data governance model, because governments across the developing world are willing to emulate its approach, because it's a model that came with both economic development and data sovereignty. So it's a model that has ensured both data sovereignty and rapid digital development. The second point is that China influences global data framework through its tech firms, who are playing an increasingly important role in international digital technology standard bodies, right? So when you have, for instance, 70% of Africa's 4G network built by Huawei, clearly Huawei, when it goes to big technology standard setting bodies has a voice in determining how the international standards are going to be set and the rules that will basically govern the digital economy. By providing digital infrastructure, Beijing is also shaping the conditions under which countries transition towards a digitally mediated economies and societies. So I'm kind of building on this theoretical framework like in the paper to try and understand the Beijing effect in Egypt's emerging digital data governance framework. So in terms of methodology, I conducted about 40 semi-structured interviews for that figure in this paper. That was between February and March 2022, so it's quite recent data. The interviews were conducted with managers and ICT engineers at Chinese firms based in Egypt, Huawei, ZTE, and others. I also interviewed people working for Western-based competitors. I've spoken to policymakers, to people responsible of Egypt's digital data governance framework, and spoken to fellow researchers working on the question. So I focus here mainly in this paper on data centers as smart cities, and I'm going to come to the findings in a bit. So data was collected during and after the fieldwork from financial and business newspapers and the company's annual reports as well. And I collected also some quantitative data via interviews. One must note that the digital Silk Road, and when it comes to digital data governance, is quite a difficult topic to study because of the high level of opacity surrounding these questions. So it wasn't always easy to get access. Okay, so we'll start with data centers. So Egyptian authorities have in recent years attempted to promote what one would call the country's data sovereignty strategy, and they've been engaged in localizing their data by building a number of data centers locally. So previously, and this is the case in other African countries, most of the data would be stored abroad. Africa has one of the lowest data storage capacity. And this creates obviously big problems when it comes to data sovereignty, because most of the continent's data is stored in data centers in Europe or in the US or elsewhere. And in recent years, you have this push for many governments to try and localize data within the national borders. So Huawei was actually selected to build most of these data centers. And so several Egyptian ministries and agencies are now relying on Huawei to build their data centers. So many Egyptian universities, most recently there was this partnership signed between Egypt's National Research Center, the NRC, and Huawei to localize their data center built and operated by Huawei. So what I find is that while Egypt's data localization efforts are arguably more beneficial to the local economy than, basically having their data stored abroad, the way data localization is taking place is not fostering the expected domestic technological learning and innovation, because most of these platforms and the software used to treat the data is actually managed by Huawei and foreign engineers. And from what I've seen during my fieldwork is that local engineers and institutions still have very little capacity in processing the data and kind of extracting economic value from their own data. So it is stored locally, which is arguably better than having the data, flowing internationally to big economic hubs in the West. But still, in terms of management of this data, there are clear asymmetries that are apparent. So that there exists obviously a significant difference between those who own the data and those who have the technological capacity to use it, both within and across countries. When it comes to smart cities, I've noticed similar issues emerging. I'm just trying to go briefly because I know we don't have much time. So I'm skipping lots of details, but I'm happy to come back to this during the Q&A session. So what you're seeing on the right is a picture of Egypt's new capital. So Egypt has been building a new administrative capital that has mainly been built by Chinese constructors. And Huawei has a big role here in like providing surveillance equipment, in providing like sensors and like the softwares that are like managing this smart city that's, you know, almost completed. So Egypt's new capital. So smart cities and surveillance technology around along the DSR are obviously one of the highlights of the digital Silk Road, and Huawei has been a key player in this. It signed an important partnership recently with an Egyptian real estate company called Tatwir Masr. And I've been kind of analyzing the nature of this partnership. And so what's happening is that Tatwir Masr is building new cities and is aiming to build sustainable smart cities in Egypt. But beyond building concrete, technically, and like owning the land, Tatwir Masr does not have the technical capacity to really engage in, you know, building smart cities. And in the relationship with Huawei, like fieldwork has revealed that there isn't much technology transfer taking place on the ground. So the result is this unequal partnership where you have on one hand, one actor that has very developed technical capacities and another one that, you know, is not necessarily learning and upgrading its own technological capabilities. So partnerships underpinning this project raises concern about who gets to actually collect, process, and learn from the data generated by smart cities equipment. Partnerships, as I just said, bring together a technological leader, that is Huawei, with a deep understanding of complex digital and technological product, with a firm that lack any data processing abilities. And frankly, kind of talking to actors there, there didn't seem to be much awareness or like willingness to like really engage in kind of capturing more of the process and like trying to process the data and extract economic value from it and engage more in this process that would create more economic spillovers than just kind of relying on a foreign actor. So, and also another important component to this is the fact that there are important political and geopolitical risks associated to this. So smart cities come with important surveillance equipment. And this is actually a model that suits the Egyptian government because, you know, after the Arab Spring, there's been like this desire to control, you know, the masses and like to kind of try and restrict public, like to restrict protests. However, the fact that Egypt does not have the technological capabilities to really like run these technologies means that, you know, the Egyptian regime might be putting itself under the control of a bigger surveillance mission, if you want, and that is the one led by China. Though we don't have empirical evidence of like to what extent the Chinese are using these technologies to spy. There is the famous Addis Ababa scandal of the African Union's headquarters, where investigations showed that data was diverted from Addis Ababa to Shanghai for, you know, for several months. But then, yeah, this obviously opens the door to spying. And I think that the aim of establishing data sovereignty will remain elusive as long as African countries don't develop their own capacity to own this technology and to, you know, collect the data, process it, and learn from it. So to conclude, Egypt has been engaged in superficial data localization effort, whereby you'd have strategic data from strategic sectors like defense, health, finance is now increasingly localized within national borders, but is still managed by foreign multinationals due to local firms and institutions' lack of processing capacities. So while these efforts are obviously better than the initial model where you'd have all of the data being stored abroad. Leveraging the full developmental power of data requires not just territorial control over it, but also effective control over the corporations that build, operate, and maintain the underpinning infrastructure, regardless of the country's, regardless of the countries of origin. So it's not obviously just Chinese firms, but it seems that like Chinese firms are the newcomers and are becoming the new custodians of African-generated data. And obviously previously American firms and European firms were holding this role. So finding indicates that Chinese firms, like their Western competitors, are becoming custodians of locally generated data with significant implications for the future of African knowledge economies. Policy recommendations briefly. So as data increasingly becomes a strategic asset, African governments opt to adopt more systematic and interventionist approaches to truly leverage the value of data and help digital transformation. Besides boosting investment in human capital and investing in indigenous research and development capabilities, governments would gain from implementing policies that protect and support the growth of local firms, facilitating their integration in complex knowledge networks. And finally, greater regional collaboration could help smaller economies maximize the gains from global digital initiatives like the Digital Spurred. This has been seen elsewhere. So obviously Europe has its famous like data governance framework, the GDPR, that became like the gold standard when it comes to data governance. And African economies would really gain by trying to come up with a more regional framework that would increase their bargaining power when negotiating with tech giants like Huawei. And this would ultimately help maximize the gains for local economies. I am going to stop here. Thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Tinian, for this very insightful and empirically informed presentation. I will now pass the floor to Dr. Souley Ibrahim, who will be presenting on security and human security dimensions in Africa-China relations with the example of Ghana. So you can share your slides as well.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone. And as so my name is Souley Ibrahim, and today my topic is people-centered engagement, and I'm looking at Ghanaian perspectives on China's security relations. So it's got this my presentation outline. I'll do introduction and objectives, and then I'll go to my conceptual framework, conceptual methodological issues, and I'll provide a brief overview of China-Ghana relations over the years to present, and I will look at my findings and discussion, and I'll offer a few policy outline, and then questions and answers comes from there. So basically, Ghana and China have been in relationships dating back to the 1960s, precise 1961, and this relationship evolved along different dimensions. But in the literature on the status of Ghana-China relation, the focus tends to be on the economic relation between the two countries. So we have a lot of discussion on trade, investment, loans, grants, debt release. And there's even a more stronger view that China is Ghana's biggest trading partner. And there have been a lot of evidence that do to support that, like Ghana in 2020 exported 1.7 billion worth of goods and services to China, and also imported 6.7 that about also from China in 2020, making Ghana or China the biggest trading partner of Ghana. And there have also been few studies on security relations between the two countries, but those studies are focused on elite, at the elite level, more like elite-driven state perspective, highlighting China engagement in Ghana state security architecture. We look about construction of the defense military headquarters, and they look about army headquarters, police intelligence headquarters. We look at joint exercises between Chinese security officers and Ghanaian security officers, the army, navy, police. We look at the training and transfer of technology, and we also look at China weapons sale to Ghana, which more amount to 46% of all total weapons that Ghana received or over the period of 2000 to 2008. So basically, you find few perspectives on non-elite, ordinary people in society and how they are feeling about Ghana engagement of China in the security area. And a lot of grievances are also emerging in our society in respect to China presence at the societal level. So I decided to take a look at, investigate how Ghanaians perceive and describe China's security engagement. And also from there, I'll provide policy direction to enhance emerging China and Ghana security friendship. So I started my study within the human security model, the linkage between security and development, because if you look at this few discussion on China engagement in Africa in the security area, most of the discussions works with that kind of concept or dimension, where China emphasizes issues of security as inclusive of issues of development and economic prosperity and poverty reduction as bedrock of peace and security. And yet China is indifferent towards domestic issues of foreign countries. And because it relies so much on elite perspective, the societal grievances are often left unaddressed. And I think when I decided, so, okay, I'll draw on this concept, but I'll focus at the societal level. So I'm looking at issues of welfare, well-being, concerns of people and communities. I'm looking at issues of crime, violence, grievances with linkages to China presence at the societal level. And I'm also looking at how Ghana and China state approach some of these grievances. And methodology happened to be qualitative one. I use a 16 publication to provide the historical overview between Ghana and China, overview of China and Ghana relationship. And I'll then go to semi-structured interviews with civil society actors who are normally called to do analysis of security matters, and they are called security analysts. And I also engage with lawmakers and also university professors. So overall, I triangulate these two data, the historical overview and then the semi-structured interviews, and I'll then come out with the Ghanaian perspectives on China's security relationship. So first, I'll take through the historical overview. And if you look at Ghana-China relationship since the 1960s, you more or less have two generations with four phases or shifts. Because the first generation, how the first generation started with elite friendship and political solidarity between Chinese political leaders and Ghanaian political leaders, especially the first president of Ghana, who initiated this friendship in the 1960s. But he was overthrown in 1966 and the relations stalled. So from 1966 to somewhere in the 1970s, even though Ghana supported China in securing the UN seat, the relations were not that much strong as it started with Nkrumah and the years from the 1990s when President Rawlings was invited to Beijing, and these relations were restored and they started cooperation. So these are the first three shifts within the first generation of China-Ghana relationship. For the second generation, we have the state level elite interaction have been retained, but it's that there have been different shifts or different dimensions where China more or less is no longer about having friendship with political leaders, but being business minded. So Ghana became a democratic country. China is not a democratic country, but China can relate with the political parties at both sides. One is pro-right, which is the NPP government or the NPP party. And then the other one's a pro-left, which also well with China, and China deals with all of them, irrespective of which parties in power. They have that kind of cordial relationship with the two parties in the country. And there also be issues of Ghanaian elites being more consensus in the way they engage China. I believe that China is an important ally, irrespective of which political divider you stand. So there'll be that consensus among the elite in the way they engage China, even though they might have their political banters when it comes to signing deals. They generally agree that where Ghana is, or where Ghana and China relationship is very important for them to go together. And they also engage China on issues of development. If you look at trying to bridge development infrastructure gap of the country, so focus on roads, schools, hospital, markets. A lot of Chinese companies are engaged or Chinese investment in these areas. And in this period, we have influx of Chinese investors, private investors coming in, also migrants also coming in. So it's not just about the state engaging the state, but private individuals interested in economic activities and private companies interested in economic activities are also coming to the country. And that's also where we begin to have the problem at the societal level. So the increased presence of China at the societal level is also breeding China-centric grievances, because the China state is still dealing with the state of Ghana, but China private citizens and companies are at the local level and engaging with the people. But the state does not have that connection with the local level. And that's where the grievances are coming from. So we have claims of violation of local content laws. We have local content law that bans foreigners from selling, doing petty trade or selling the small items or hawking in the markets. But we have Chinese investors or private citizens doing those kind of business and generating that sentiment. We have alluvial or artisanal mining, locally known as galamsey, which is local mining, or that type of mining is mostly reserved for indigenous people. But Chinese, the ways that the laws are allowed for foreigners to be partnered so that they supply goods and services. And this avenue has also been exploited by private investors to engage in galamsey or local mining. And we have increased complexity of national and local elites in these grievances, because those who more or less front for the Chinese investors largely happen to be with those close with powers. And at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level, they're all involved. And so when the grievances come up, you see that the local people find difficult to extricate the Ghanaian elites from the grievance they have for China. So they box all of them together. And the sentiment is that China more or less is the problem. And so, and the biggest part of this problem is that both states have yet to recognize this problem, that they have a problem at the bottom at the societal level, and the state is not engaging, neither the Chinese state or the Ghanaian state is engaging with these grievances comprehensively. So it's from there that I did my study, which was semi-structured interviews with the law university professors and then civil society actors and the lawmakers. And you could identify three main perspectives that are coming from, and I put them as benefit, threat, and mitigation continually move along that dimension. So you have the benefit dimension, where the general perception is, or the general view is that engaging China in the security sector enhances Ghana peaceful development. So that one is widely recognized, because they believe is that China supplying the Ghana army, police, military, and immigration is going to enhance or strengthen the state security system. And they also believe that the China involvement in the construction of roads, hospitals, schools, markets is also going to help Ghana bridge its infrastructure development gap as a fastly growing economy and urbanizing country. And a lot of the infrastructures are more or less old style, and we having Chinese participating or bring their technology in. So we have that kind of support, and believe that engaging China in the security sector could enhance people's welfare and well-being at the societal level, and also could lead to technological and expertise transfer from Chinese companies to Ghana. They also claim that it's sending a message signaling to other global powers that Ghana international relationship is strategically autonomous, in the sense that Ghana engage with China and also engage with other country. So because Ghana can engage with China without compromising its relationship with traditional allies. So Ghana is hoping to engage with all other countries, not just China. So there's that kind of description or understanding there. And there's also a view that provides Ghana with diverse options to engage in international system. Means if Ghana used to engage with the EU, US, and UK, and China has come in, means present another relation toolbox with country to engage on what particular issue as far as security is concerned. Right? So those kind of claims are also emerging. And then we have the threat perspective, which is quite dominant in the discussion. And the fears or the worries are that China deploys its superpower strategy to bulldoze Ghana to acquiesce to Chinese interest. So that kind of claims are there in the sense that China is not a benevolent actor. It projects self-interested power at the expense of Ghana. So because China power is more or less higher or greater or bigger than Ghana, it will be difficult for Ghana and China to negotiate and get a deal or relationship that is equitable or mutually beneficial for the both countries compared to as it will benefit China. And also perception that or description that that relationship also exposes Ghana to hostilities of China international force or competitors. So we talk about the mostly the US and the UK. So okay, they already have a traditional relationship with Ghana. So Ghana bringing China in and China having competition with these global powers and international system. That means the hostility between those two countries or those powers are likely to be transferred to Ghana. And there have been instances where people will make claims to the US having a quasi-military base in Ghana. If Ghana is going to go further and engage China and provide a military base, that could be another challenge. And there have also been issues, pointers, making claims to the CIA involvement in the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah in the 1966 thereabout. So those historical views keep on coming in people's mind. And also with concerns about elite complicity and personal ambition undermining Ghana's strategic autonomy. So instead of the elites negotiating with China with the national interests at hand, they more or less want to sign deals that will benefit them and their political parties. So which parties in power will sign the kind of deal that was interest in the political party instead of in the interest of the national state. And there will also be a lot of issues about corruption and colluding with Chinese private investors. And that is where the problem is coming at the societal level. Political leaders or elites fronting for Chinese investors at the expense of local laws, and that creates problem at the societal level. And there also concerns that Ghana suffers insufficient expertise on China and Chinese business-minded attitude. So more like Ghana doesn't have that much expertise when it comes to China and how to engage China. So relying on elite or political knowledge instead of expert knowledge in dealing with China could be a disadvantage in Ghana, and it's in terms of how Ghana engage China in reaching out or signing deals that is of benefit to the security of this country. And there are also concerns about China indifference towards illicit activities of Chinese private citizens. And that has created a situation of an apparent situation of no official China at the societal level, because China officially engage with the state and expect the elites of the country to engage with the local level. And the elites are complicit in the local problems. So there's no China at the societal level. And that's also another problem. And also, so the claims of petty trading, which portray China as disregarding local laws or local content laws, Chinese involvement in artisanal mining linked with China with destruction of farmlands, water bodies, and destruction of environmental destruction. So those are the general issues that you find in the threat perspective. So the overall view is that Ghana, unlike China, is more likely to be threatened in engaging China in security cooperation from the threat perspective, unlike the benefit perspective, where we have a lot of support that yes, we can behind Ghana's peaceful development. So the mitigation, people are not just saying the benefits and also looking at the threat, they're also suggesting the way forward to deal with some of these issues. And there will be concerns about focusing on soft security, that Ghana should engage China in dealing with issues that have to do with the lives, livelihood, and lifestyles of the people, not just about supplying weapons and fighter jets or engaging in the military drills and all that, but be concerned with matters that affect lives, livelihoods, and lifestyle of the people. And official China promotes peaceful coexistence between unofficial China and local, more or less the Chinese state, the way it engages with the state of Ghana should extend to the local level to engage with the local people. But that is where the Chinese problems are coming from. And there also be concerns about engaging China to address Galamsey cause environmental degradation. More like because Chinese citizens are involved so much in this kind of problem, then they should be part of resolving the problem. And there's concerns about engaging China to promote food security, especially in Galamsey threatened community, because the Galamsey menace is not just destroying the land and all those things, but destroying farms and and it causes a lot of deforestation. So how can you ensure food security in those areas without involving the party that's somehow mentioned in this problem? So there have been concerns about that. There also be concerns about involving civil society in Chinese activities in the country, like China dealing with the state alone. It leaves a gap in the civil society, and that creates a problem. It's like civil society have no idea what China is doing in the country, and China is also not explaining to civil society what it's doing in the country. Why not include civil society groups in China, Ghana-China peace and security arrangements, and also promote regular Ghana-China civil society or people-to-people meetings, and also support for independent and transparent official Chinese engagement in Ghana. And there have also been issues about dealing with, or the elite of Ghana engaging with China with the right mindset in the sense that they prioritizing Ghana national interests over their ambitions. There have been concerns on that, and there have also been concerns of Ghana-China being committed to independently verifiable protocols to control corruption tendencies. So more like the two countries to come up with certain protocols for independent verification of how they relate to one another in signing deals or in engaging in certain interactions. And Ghana should engage China by having very sufficient knowledge about China's business mindedness. So Ghana should not just grant or more like welcome China's openness, but it should have some level of knowledge about China in engaging China on its openness or in terms of its business. So the view that Ghana benefit less from security relations with China means that yes, those threats are there, but those threats can be improved. So if you look at the mitigation measures, means if these mitigation measures are put in place, there's possibility that the threats can be minimized. So that is why I then moved to my policy outlines. And the policy outline have it in two ways. I have one for Ghana and also one for the China side. So in view of all this discussion, what I come is, okay, Ghana should maintain an open foreign policy so that you can engage with any superpower country without compromising ties with others. So Ghana can engage with China without compromising ties with US or with UK or EU, and consciously safeguard the country against hostilities of China competitors in an international system. If you have an open foreign policy, you should be to encourage your other foreign partners to understand your needs and the reason why you're engaging China on this particular need and engaging the US on another particular need. And then also prioritize strategic autonomy. It should be seen at a societal level. Ghana, the interest of the state that the political elites will prioritize in its relationship with China should be seen at a societal level for people to know that, yes, there's some kind of respect for Ghana. If it's not seen at a societal level and it only remains with the elites, then it will be difficult for ordinary person to think that or perceive that China is really actually dealing with Ghana on a fair or equitable terms. And also, it would be good if for Ghana to establish a national consortium on China in the sense that to offer elites with national in-kind expert ideas, not elites guiding themselves with political interests or ambitions when dealing with China, because China has come to stay, and China is dealing with any political party with business minded, not whether it's political party A that is in power or B that is in power. So we have a national consortium that provides ideas to guide this relationship. It might help for Ghana. And also produce national protocols for engaging China business minded posture. And also offer jointly verifiable and enforceable transparency framework. So both countries need to come up with a sort of transparency framework that is enforceable, not just in Ghana, but also in China. So Ghanaian citizens or Chinese citizens who engage in negativity, either in China or in Ghana, can be enforced by the two countries, irrespective of where the individual decides to relocate. If the individual commits the wrongs or the ills in Ghana, he moves to China, China should be to sanction its citizens over there. And if it's the reverse, then Ghana should be able to do so. So there have been those concerns. Also have China commit to sub-security issues. China shouldn't be involved or engaged in providing state-level security, supporting the military, police, and intelligence agencies, but also be committed to addressing China grievances at the societal level. So in other words, to be committed to engaging in deals, scrutiny that affect the livelihood and lifestyles of people, especially grievances that will have links to China, and also include civil society in China's scrutiny relationships. And the policy outline for China, on the other hand, I will suggest China recognizing and addressing misgivings about its soft power posture. These are concerns that people harbor or tend to have. And if the Chinese state is not recognizing this and dealing with it, it means it will become endemic, and that will become a more problematic for Ghana-China relation in the future, especially the importance of incorporating public concerns when engaging non-power state elites, and also understand non-power state elites such as Ghana also have traditional allies, and people will always evaluate the type of benefit that they get from the traditional allies vis-a-vis the incoming allies. So if the evaluation between Ghana relation with the US or UK vis-a-vis the relationship between Ghana and China, if the people think that there are more threats coming from the China side, then you have a lot of concerns about China. But if China recognizes and also act promptly on it, it might moderate those crises. And also, it seems important for China to vary its indifference policy towards domestic issues, because if China continuously with the indifference policy, more or less like you will not do anything with whatever is happening in society, you continue to expect the elites to address those problems. And those problems are also shared. Not just the local elites are part of the problems, but the problems affect Ghana as much as they affect China. And once the elites are part of the problem, they alone cannot be expected to address those problems. So it's engaged with those grievances coming from societal level as legitimate was shared, collaborate, and address them, and being committed to independently verifiable and transparent working framework with Ghana. And also last one, have a direct engagement with civil society, which is very important. And so more like the need for China to have a strong presence in civil society as an agency between people and government. China cannot for civil society to deal with some of the China-linked illicit activities that are often reported, because most often you find the media doing a lot of reporting, and anytime the China and the media, it comes, they come into contact, it's kind of like a friction. China almost come in more like try to condemn or try to guide the media out of what they are reporting, but China is part of what they are reporting, and see how can the two of them engage. I think that might also help to alleviate some of these threats that are affecting Ghana-China relations. All right, thanks so much. I appreciate your time and your questions, comments, and suggestions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sule Ibrahim. We are running a bit late, but Lina, I will invite you to comment on both presentations by Tin Hinan and Dr. Sule Ibrahim. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Folashade Sule, for the invitation to act as a discussant for this panel. I want to begin by thanking our friends and colleagues at Cora for managing to make this terrific space for African scholars and African diaspora scholars to present and give and add their voices and important research and scholarship to the Africa-China field. So thank you so much. Congratulations to both our presenters. These were excellent papers. The papers show a deep knowledge of the themes tackled, but also really rich empirical research that that is going to enhance our understanding of the Africa-China relations, both in the general theme of governance, but specifically looking at at technology, looking at the digital Silk Road specifically, and looking at the China, the development security nexus. So the papers tackle very different themes, but they speak very nicely to one another, because they approach these big topics and these big themes around governance from kind of Africa-centered perspective, right? So both of them are trying to give us the other side of the story. Lots and lots and lots of scholarship and research on China-Africa relations, both from excuse me, the perspective of digital Silk Road or the development security nexus, tend to come to us from predominantly from the China, kind of China-centered side. So these are excellent papers. They're terrific papers that complement and really just shift our attention to thinking about Africa-China relations from a wholly different perspective there. So I will begin with Tin Hinan's paper, just following the order in which our presenters gave their papers. Tin Hinan's paper titled "The Digital Silk Road and Emerging African Data Governance Frameworks: Evidence from Egypt." The paper is excellent. It's really well organized. It's well written. I always learn a lot from Tin Hinan and her expertise on the digital Silk Road. So it was a pleasure for me to read this, and I've learned a lot from this paper, just as usual. So my comments are just going to be trying to maybe think about how best maybe to move the paper forward, and to hone in the theme of governance on the paper. So I like to focus on the concept of the Beijing effect. That was really fascinating as a theoretical framework, Tin Hinan. I was most interested in this kind of diffusing governance model aspect of the Beijing effect. And time again, as I'm reading the paper, I'm asking myself, is the Egypt model actually telling us, what is it telling us about this diffusing governance of China, and unintentionally diffusing its governance model? Is the evidence from Egypt telling us that is it on the Egypt side that there is not a lot of willingness to actually have sovereignty, or is it that this Beijing effect, is it by itself, is it built in a way that doesn't open possibilities for these countries to actually become sovereign because they don't have the kind of the capacities, right? So what you're describing there is that, that these countries are, in a sense, since you're saying diffusing, right? So China is unintentionally diffusing its governance model, and the governance model is about data sovereignty and about the use of it in economic development. But we're not seeing, right, after the case is developed and analyzed, we're not seeing the diffusion, right? So where is that diffusion? At what level do we see the diffusion of China's governance model being diffused in the case of Egypt? So how do you evaluate, right? So when you're building on this theoretical framework, what do you see, right, that you can add? What does the Egypt case tell us, right, to add to this Beijing effect theoretical framework that you use? And related to that, it was really interesting to me to read actually from your paper on the case of Senegal, and actually it really made me curious. So why Egypt and not Senegal, right? So like why? So I understand your logic, at least in the presentation you present to us why Egypt. It kind of was part of the first time when the 13th five-year plan and so on and so forth, but it seemed to me what you were arguing or what you were mentioning in the paper, that there is something to mine about Senegal in terms of being the first African country that actually is wanting to kind of exercise that sovereignty, right? So put in, kind of the data centers and the control and all of that within the borders of Senegal, which is, I think that would be a good case to analyze, because then it would tell us, is there diffusion, right? Is it diffused in a way that's working? Is it efficiently diffused? What do we know? What do we learn at the end of this case about that diffusion, right? So So in a sense that's what left me kind of wanting in the paper. What do we learn from the case of Egypt that can tell us more about the African continent and about this governance question, the topic of governance on a larger scale? So I'm not asking to generalize, but in a sense, make that transition for us, right? So tell us what do we learn from the case of Egypt that can tell us and enhance our understanding of China-Africa relations from this perspective of data governance, right? So just to add a little bit, sort of kind of like do that kind of that bridge. But I really do think at some point, right, in the future, it might actually really be great to compare to Senegal, right? So to kind of like really dig into what's going on. And so is it, you know, doing something different? But this also leads me a little bit to the theoretical framework that you're using. I mean, it seems to me there was a bit in the paper about globalization, which I thought was okay, but actually, like if you also included sovereignty in the theoretical framework, it would actually make a lot of sense, right? So it seemed to me that the paper is adding a huge contribution to the way we understand sovereignty. And there is just not enough in relation, and I'm thinking about international relations theories, because that's kind of like the discipline I'm coming into this conversation from. There's not a lot in that literature on how sovereignty is understood from this perspective of data governance. There's a tiny bit, but not enough. And definitely not from the African kind of perspective. So I think that the paper can actually add so much to this conversation. It can contribute a lot to the conversation on sovereignty if you kind of really, you know, you hint at sovereignty here and there, right? You talk about data sovereignty in the analysis, but not in the theoretical framework. So I think that there's something there that you can kind of hook your paper to the scholarship on sovereignty, and you can just actually really make a huge contribution there. So not necessarily for this paper, right? So I'm helping you just think about different ways of how you can move this forward, right? So kind of the comparative case with Senegal, or thinking about sovereignty as your main theoretical framework, and kind of moving forward with that. So the last thing I will mention about your paper, Tinhinan, is I would have actually also liked to see a little bit more of the Egyptian perspective in the paper. So the perspective from Egypt, meaning, so I know that, you know, I've done a lot of interviews, and the interviews kind of, you know, they show really nicely in the paper. So but I was wondering if you can add a little bit more of that voice, right? So add a bit more so we can have a better understanding of, you know, what is it on the Egyptian side? What's the ideal what's the ideal case? What is the goal? What would be the ideal case from the Egyptian side? And then we can understand sort of the challenges, limitations of kind of what you find is happening on the ground. So all the information you shared that the engineers gave you from the interviews it's excellent, right? So, but at the same time, it doesn't give us the larger picture of what is really the goal in Egypt, right? So it doesn't give us like sort of that kind of like broader view of what the hopes, aspirations, goals of data governance are in Egypt, right? So I think adding a little bit on that would be great. So if there were, let's say, government papers, white papers, whatever comparable papers that you analyze on the China side, if you can do that on the Egypt side and just give us a little bit more of that, then it gives us a standard, you know, that we can come back and say, well, you know, it's a missed target, right? So the target is missed on this one, or the target was achieved on this one, and so on and so forth. And so that actually, I think, would be helpful. But all in all, I mean, this was great paper. Like I said, I always learn a lot from you. So this was just another time for me to actually, you know, learn more about the specific case of Egypt, and it was great. So thank you so much for that. I want to move on now to Dr. Ibrahim's paper. The paper is on people-centered engagement, Ghanaians' perspectives on China security relations. The paper is very enjoyable to read. It's excellent. It's very well organized. The research on it is extremely rich. It has a very thorough and deep analysis of the scholarship, the literature. It does a really good job telling us what is missing in the scholarship. There's just so much on China, Africa. By now, security relations, especially the development security nexus, so much of that, Dr. Ibrahim tells us, is focusing on security thinking about it from sort of the elite perspective. It's not thinking about security from the people perspective, which is great, because then the paper comes in and says, now the paper is going to add to our understanding of both China-Africa development security nexus, but also the theoretical framework, by kind of adding this people-centered perspective, which is a much needed one. So this is a really rich contribution. It's a great contribution, and it helps us understand China-Africa relations from the development security nexus a lot better through the paper. So there's a lot to enjoy in the paper, like I said, especially with the interviews, the richness of the field work is really amazing, actually, in both papers. But specifically in this one, I really liked how refreshing the perspective is from, you know, the various quotes used from the interviews. You know, time and time again, the interviews, you know, say things like, yeah, I mean, it's not enough to think about getting ammunition and getting, you know, fighter jets and rifles and all these things from partners. It's really important to come back and think about what this means for people. So I think that that's a really refreshing kind of perspective, and it's really important, and it's quite interesting to focus on that. What I think would be really interesting for the paper moving forward, right? So these are comments to just kind of really not about the research, but really about the papers as I read them, thinking about how best to move them forward in terms of kind of, from my perspective, really academic kind of writing, because I'm not going to comment on the policy recommendations. I think the paper starts by giving a really good kind of summary of the development security nexus, and then it goes to China-Ghana relations specifically, and then it does the analysis that the paper adds through the interviews. But then I think it should go back to the theoretical framework. There should be a section that kind of translates to us, what does this fieldwork tell us about the framework where we started, about the development security nexus? How can this help us add something to the development security nexus? So go back to it so that we're not just forgetting about it. We're not just mentioning the theoretical framework at, you know, around page 8, 10, and then that's it, and then it goes away. We needed to come back so that you then the paper makes that big impact, right? So here's what's been done about the development security nexus. Here's the case on China-Ghana relations. Here's my analysis, and this is how it can improve. Right, this is how I can build on the development security nexus. And what I think the paper does a lot to build on the development security nexus, mainly in that it highlights the challenge. Right? It does highlight a huge challenge for the development security nexus to work. It says, look, development security nexus is built on this understanding of kind of government to government, state to state relations, elite to elite relations. This is just not going to work in Ghana, right? Because why? Because we have a huge kind of problem that there's a gap. The impressions and from civil society organizations are not reflected in the development security nexus. There are these people-centered kind of issues, right, that come from artisanal mining, that come from climate and environment impact, that come from immigration, that come from all of these kind of low-level citizen level, people level, human level issues that are not reflected up there. And that gap is going to really be a huge challenge for the development security nexus to be effectively implemented, or for that framework to actually work. So I think what this paper does is really give us an excellent empirical case for the challenges of the development security nexus in the China-Africa scholarship. And I think that it should just own that. It should just say that this is what it's doing in terms of how it's complementing, or how it's building on, or how it's critiquing, or how it's kind of, you know, situating itself next to the development security nexus. Now, the one thing that I will say, though, I have read the paper, maybe I should read it again. I will read it again, probably. But what is the definition of human security, right? So there's a little bit of human security, there's people-centered security, that sort of these concepts are used in the paper interchangeably. So I think if you're using human security in the sort of in the IR literature sense, then maybe say that. But if you are innovating on it and then put in this kind of people-centered, if it means something different in this context, I would say also own it. So come to add that and just situate it, and then just kind of give a definition of the parameters, the scope of that concept and what it means. And I think that would be great to do. But I also found it a little bit ironic when we have all of these quotes, these great quotes from all these analysts from the interviews that mention how they're absolutely in favor of thinking about a people-centered approach. But then in one of the last slides, one of the recommendations is that the benefit of China-Ghana relations comes from more Navy, more police, more kind of the security, which was very traditional. So in a way, help us digest that a little bit. What does that mean, right? So if we're going to start from people-centered and then we end on traditional, how do we square that, right? So maybe get us a little bit help, right, to kind of translate that a little bit to the reader, so that it doesn't take away from the richness and the depth of the interviews that the paper so very eloquently highlights. So yeah, so with this I conclude my remarks. Again, I really enjoyed reading both papers. Thank you both so much for sharing with me, and I much look forward to seeing them in their future shapes and published, and much look forward to reading them, assigning them, and learning more from them. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lina Ben Abdallah. I think that the panelists have also learned a lot from your comments, and I'm sure they will be very useful to improve their papers and provide a final version of it soon. I will open the floor now to all the participants. Do you have any questions? If so, please raise your hand or write your question down in the Q&A box. I see that there's already one question here from Deborah Hurd about a Chinese investment in Africa. I think that one is for you, Tin Hinan, on the human resource dimension in technology projects, and how can African countries gain their own technological proficiency and demand more independence on the Chinese relations. Okay. There's also, maybe what I'll do is pick a couple of questions, like 2 or 3, and then I'll move. And then I'll let you answer. We have one from Winslow Robertson. So please, yes. Please go ahead.
Sure, I'll make this quite brief. Thank you so much. Incredible presentations. Tin, regarding your idea of sort of the use of data and development, I'm working on a project around ideology and AI development and workflows, and basically a lot of people who work on data science and on AI basically say that the use of data generally isn't that helpful for most organizations outside of some very specific issues. And I'm wondering, maybe going back to Alina's point, maybe sort of if the value is much more about data sovereignty than actual technology transfer for usage of data, which frankly, even in Silicon Valley, a lot of big tech firms have so much data, they don't really know what to do with it. Maybe that might be a good way to bridge what you're trying to do. But I maybe explain for the audience, or for me, who's pretty ignorant about this, what does data development look like? Why would the ability to harness data help for the state, and not be perhaps hype, if I might be so bold?
Tin Hinan, I'll let you answer the questions.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to start with this last question. Well, thanks a lot for that. So, no, you're right. There is a lot of data that's created today, from like just basic internet usage and all like Internet of Things objects, that there is like a tremendous level, like amount of data, and often not all of this data is useful. However, with like the development of AI and like future like potential economic usage of data, there is a lot of it that we don't know yet to what extent some of this digital data might have economic value or might not have economic value. Some of it already has huge commercial usage, you know, just like understanding the behavior of consumers, understanding the behavior of citizens, and being able to then shape and design applications that fit the interests of large populations. So I don't think we can dismiss the idea that data has economic value. Clearly, like you have some major economies now, including China, considering data as an important commodity, as a factor of production. Actually, China voted a law, I think it was in 2019, considering that digital data was like capital and land and labor considered as a factor of production. And so it has, beyond just the question of sovereignty, has and can have even more in the future significant economic value. And the problem now as it stands is that most of the data generated on the African continent is captured by foreign groups, mainly American groups, but also now increasingly Chinese firms. So I'm coming to this from a development economics perspective and trying to really understand and like ways of leveraging the economic value of data for African economies. Yeah, I was wondering if Lashade, can I also tackle Lina's comments, or are we doing this later?
If you have like very brief response to some of her comments, yes.
Okay, perfect. Lina, thanks a lot for your comments. Very sharp and useful as always. Yeah, you're perfectly right. I also think, because I came back to the paper like while I was preparing the presentation, and I think I need to maybe go back to it like towards the end to kind of like explain why the Egyptian case can be useful for the rest of African economies. And like this question of like diffusing the Beijing effects in terms of data governance, I think the main takeaway is that you have a lot of African economies trying to mimic China's governance model when it comes to digital data. And they're just doing it, unfortunately, at the moment at a superficial level, whereby data is being localized in national borders, but still with very little capacity to, you know, have more control over this data. And so it's like maybe one step forward, like in the right direction, but still there is more to do. And again, unlike we often read in a lot of like big media, it's not a model that's being imposed. Like China is not imposing its digital authoritarianism model. It's often called upon African countries, but it's more these countries being attracted to the Chinese model for its success in generating rapid digital development. The idea of comparing to Senegal, it's a very good idea. It's actually, I thought about it before. So Senegal was the first country doing that, like kind of signing this high-level partnership with Huawei. But now what we're seeing in Egypt and elsewhere is very similar. So it also makes sense looking at these countries. The problem is that, yeah, a PhD in the UK is just 4 years, which does not give me time to really like go and add Senegal to my case studies, but why not for a postdoc? I think it would be a great idea for sure. The idea of expanding more on sovereignty is a great one, and I would definitely consider this point. It's just that I'm trying to balance this because I'm doing a PhD in political economy and like coming to this from like an economic development kind of perspective. So I think, yeah, but this is the challenge, you know, when you're doing a multidisciplinary PhD, it's also trying to look at other perspectives and how the paper can feed into other literature and like other work. And the point on sovereignty and expanding more on that is a great one. Yeah, and also adding more on the Egyptian perspective. I think that was just the size of the paper that did not kind of allow me to expand much more on that. But it's a really good point, and definitely need to address what kind of the African perspective on data governance looks like, and then to what extent what's happening is helping, African economies and African countries meet the expectations. That's a really good point. Flashade, I think that was there another question? I'm not sure. Maybe there was a question from the chat, right?
Yes, the question from the chat on Chinese tech investment in Africa. How can African countries gain their own technological proficiency and demand more independence, more technological independence, which goes a bit to the topic.
Yeah,
Data sovereignty.
Yeah, I think from what we're witnessing from emerging empirical studies on the topic is that at the end of the day, it very much depends on the bargaining power of the African country. Some countries have done better than others in kind of extracting technology and knowledge from their foreign partners, whether they're Chinese or non-Chinese. I think it very much, we shouldn't have kind of like one vision over like the whole continent. Clearly, just in my own work, trying to like look at what's happening in Egypt and Algeria, for instance, the Egyptian government has actually done a better job in localizing more technology and knowledge and having more win-win partnerships, if we want to use this term, with the Chinese than the Algerians in the tech sector, for sure. So it would depend on the type of industrial policies applied by these countries and to what extent they really manage to have a meaningful local content requirements and policies for like technology transfer.
Thank you. Dr. Suleiman, do you have any comments or answers on Lina's remarks?
Right. Thank you a lot. Yeah, thanks so much. And thank you, Professor Lina. I'm very grateful for the insightful comments, and I think I will definitely take them up and in organizing the paper for the final submission is very laudable and a lot of observation there. And I'm so grateful for the comments and those observations too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions from the participants? If so, you can just raise your hand. Yeah, we have one from Paul Nantulia. So please, let me see. Yeah, you can.
Yeah, hi. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Very nice to see all of you. Great presentations by the panelists, right? Two panelists. I just had one question. Looking at how both countries have managed their relationships with China on these different elements that you've been talking about, would you argue that there has been a coherent effort by both countries, in particular Senegal, to exercise agency in dealing with Chinese entities, and to what extent has that effort been influenced and shaped by civil society organizations?
Dean Henan, would you like to provide some comments on Paul's question?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got the question, but like from what I understood, Paul, correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking to what extent were civil society organizations involved in the process with dealing with China? And so in the Egyptian case, from what I've seen during my fieldwork, is that there was a lot of groups trying to like advocate for having a more open cyberspace in China, a more kind of like a cyberspace that would be regulated by law, and limiting all of the surveillance programs that are currently being expanded by the Egyptian government. However, the way, and this kind of corroborates what Dr. Souley Ibrahim was saying, is that the way China deals with, like Egypt is very state to state, and like big corporation to ministries. Like Huawei would go and engage with the Ministry of Telecommunications in Egypt, but or the Ministry of Higher Education, with which it signed multiple partnerships for training students. However, it does not really engage with civil society groups. And so what we're seeing in Egypt is that the emerging data governance model, a model for the ICTs more broadly, ends up being very much like a top-down model that in a way kind of looks a lot like China's own model, that's pretty much top-down, with like lots of state control over the internet, the way it's being governed, the websites that are allowed and those that are blocked, and so on. So yeah, I would say that civil society groups are definitely marginalized from the debate.
Just Paul, if I can add, and I'll let you answer also, Souley Ibrahim, but just on Senegal's case that I've also started investigating a bit more is on the the data center that they are setting up. And you asked Paul whether about the question of agency, the extent to which they have agency in this process towards with Huawei. The first elements, and again, these are just like one or two Senegalese diplomats sharing their perspective. So there's much more research and empirical research that needs to be done here. But the first elements were that, well, as Tin said, it's this idea or idealization, maybe I would say, of the Chinese model of governance and of data control and state control over data that they are interested in. They were constantly coming back with this notion or concept of sovereignty. So that's really interesting, at least from an IR perspective, how how sovereignty, the sovereignty dimension was coming back very often into the discussion. And they were quite, I won't say angry, but irritated about all the criticism that was geared towards them, especially coming from some northern or Western-based media. And what was even more interesting was to say that, all these comments about data surveillance, we are aware of this, but at the same time, this is not only a China issue. Meaning that Western, some other organizations, some other states can also be accused of spying. So, meaning the criticism, at least that part of the criticism, is a bit unfair to some extent. It's not. They are not looking at. They are not also interrogating their own practices, the ones that are doing that. So, and so there was really this impression that, at least on the state control, the data control, the state control dimension, the sovereignty dimension, they have more agency at that level by partnering with China than with other organizations, at least at this level. But again, we are at the preliminary stage of the project. It hasn't been, it's still, ongoing. So this is something that needs further investigation. Just Dr. Souley Ibrahim, you have any comments on some of the questions that were asked?
Just one quick one in terms of state of Ghana and relating with China. Since the 1990s coming, or the 2000 coming, so okay, all the at the state level, the elites have come to the realization they will have to deal with China as a development, as a partner. So irrespective of which political lines, or which political party is in government, whether the one pro-left or pro-right, they all have agreed on that they will have to deal with China. But the differences is at the level of party interest or individual personal interest when they are dealing with China. That's where sometimes you have a lot of problems coming from, because one party in government dealing with China want in a way that will project the image of the party. And sometimes the one that is out of the power want to bring that down. Sometimes those are the areas that we have the friction. But for the consensus that they have to deal with China, that one is quite pronounced. And coming to the civil society, because once again, as my colleague said, China more or less relate with the state. So most of the issues that the civil society want to raise, China expect the state elites to address those issues. Meanwhile, those issues, the state elites are complicit in those issues. So that's where civil society sometimes stops with some of the information that they will need to take up forward and hold on China to account or something like that. Some of the information that they need, they will not even have it. And China is not party to provide those information. So for the civil society, their agency in holding China or the elites of Ghana accountable or trying to get a verifiable understanding of what is going on, sometimes it's quite difficult for them to have it. Recent one with the Ghana signed the 2018 barter deal for China bauxite for infrastructure deal. Some of the civil society have to go to court to address some of those issues. So it's not a quite easy way for civil society dealing with China as far as the Ghana case is concerned.
Thank you. So we have two other questions in the box, and also on technology, the role of business networks in technology transfer, and one by Isaac Odom, who's also a member of this Africa-China working group. And his question is, beyond China, do you find any evidence of other foreign entities engaged in digital transformation in Africa, and how extensive is it? Before I ask you to answer these questions, are there any other questions from the participants? If so, please raise your hand. Okay. Well, for now, I'll let you answer these questions. And if anyone has an additional question, please raise your hand in the box. Okay. Then I will let you answer there.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start with the question on technology transfer. Yeah, that's a hard one. It's like the billion-dollar question for development researchers. Well, when it comes to technology transfer, actually, China is a very good case on how a developing country, managed to get foreign FDI, basically, to come in and transfer technology to local groups, to local firms. But that was because China could leverage its huge market of more than 1 billion people, right? But it did force foreign technology firms to build joint ventures with local ones. So when a firm comes, it had to merge basically with local firms. And this creates lots of opportunities to transfer managerial knowledge, but also technical knowledge to local groups. It's what we call in development economics, vertical and horizontal linkages. So when you have a firm that comes and builds a network with local firms, it creates opportunities for learning and demonstration effect. So you have a foreign firm which has more advanced technologies and more advanced knowledge that comes to an environment, and by dealing with local firms, it would assumingly manage to upgrade their own skills and kind of help them move upwards in terms of technological practices and also managerial practices. But it needs a lot of, it needs a strong state that comes in and makes sure that the foreign firm is hiring local labor, that there is a good share of local employees in the firm that get to be exposed to the more advanced technological knowledge and so on. And often if you're in a context of a weak state, obviously firms are profit maximizing, so they will try and do whatever is more suitable for them, and this might lead to suboptimal consequences for the host country. So it very much depends on the context, and policy has a huge role to play in technology transfer. For the question on business networks, it is the same, right? You would want to make sure that there are linkages emerging between the foreign firm, let's say Huawei, whether that is local Senegalese firms or local Egyptian firms and so on, because it's this exchange that will ultimately lead to technology spillovers. The second question from Isaac, yes, so any evidence of the US and China engaged in digital transformation? Actually, at the moment, the Americans and Europeans are quite absent from the scene compared to the Chinese. It's due to many reasons, one of which, like when it comes to digital infrastructure, you don't have any big US firm doing that, right? So in this sector, the main competitors of Huawei and ZTE tend to be Scandinavian-based firms. That would be Ericsson and Nokia mainly, so a Swedish and a Finnish firm. And in terms of price, the Chinese just have a huge advantage, right? They tend to be 15 to 30% cheaper on some segments of production, and they also come with loans, right? There are loans from the China Development Bank, from the China Exim Bank, and so when you're a developing country and want to acquire these new upgraded digital infrastructure, you know, often the best option you have is going towards one of the big Chinese tech firms, because this infrastructure is expensive, and you know, European and American firms just don't have the same financial capacities as the Chinese to back the funding of this infrastructure. But also what we've noticed is that, you know, there is a lot of big claims with like the Americans especially wanting to exercise hegemony over the cyberspace and like controlling digital transformations in Africa, but they're doing this on a shoestring, like without a budget, without a big development project. It's one thing to control a sector, but without putting the means to do it. And I don't think that this would get them anywhere. And so far, the Chinese seem to be really the only players in town when it comes to large telecom networks, for developing countries.
Thank you very much. We are coming to the end of this webinar. I'd like to thank you both, Dr. Souley Ibrahim and Tin Hinan, for your excellent presentations. Dr. Lina Benagala had to go, but she will provide you with her comments, her written comments, so that you can use them and include them in the last version of your paper. So thank you all. Thank you to all the participants. Thank you for your input. And again, these presentations will later be turned into papers, and there will be a special report early 2023. So watch this space. You will be hearing more from us very soon. And there will also be a third webinar soon on other topics related to China-Africa relations. So thank you again, and have a very good evening or day from wherever you joined us. Thank you.